The massive black and red Brahman bull stood motionless atop the small white coffin, his 1,000-pound frame casting a shadow across the stunned faces of 300 mourners gathered at Hillside Cemetery. This wasn't grief. It was an alert. Funeral director Peterson stumbled backward, his clipboard clattering to the wet November ground as elderly women gasped and covered their mouths in horror. Children pointed with wide eyes while their parents pulled them closer, the morning air thick with whispered prayers and rising panic. Tom Mackenzie felt his knees buckle as he stared at Thunder protecting his 6-year-old daughter's casket, the same way the bull had positioned himself during Gracie's seizures. But she was gone, declared dead 3 days ago by Dr. Blackwood's own hand. "Get that beast off my granddaughter!" Nanabelle's voice cracked like a whip across the cemetery. But Zeke Morrison, ex-rodeo champion and decorated Army medic, stepped forward with recognition dawning in his weathered eyes. What if Thunder knew something they didn't? And what if they'd buried Gracie Mackenzie alive? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The red clay hills of Redemption Valley, Oklahoma stretched endlessly under November's gray sky, where the Mackenzie family had worked the same land for 4 generations. Population 2,847, where everyone knew your business before you did, and where the tornado sirens still made folks hold their breath and remember what they'd lost 3 springs ago. Thomas Mackenzie stood at his kitchen window, watching Thunder graze in the back pasture with the gentle patience that had made him legendary among the local ranchers. At 45, Tom carried the weight of a man who'd buried his wife too young and fought every day to keep his daughter's memory of her mother alive. The laugh lines around his eyes had deepened into worry creases since Sarah Bell's funeral, and his calloused hands trembled slightly as he held his morning coffee, black because they couldn't afford cream anymore. 6-year-old Grace Elizabeth Mackenzie had been the sunshine that broke through their storm clouds until that terrible day at the county fair. Born during the worst tornado outbreak in Oklahoma history, she'd survived her mother's death and the brain injury that followed, developing a seizure condition that turned every day into a careful dance between normal childhood and medical crisis. Her golden hair caught the light the same way Sarah Bell's had, and her laugh could still make Tom believe in miracles, even when the medical bills stacked higher than hay bales and the bank notices grew more threatening. Thunder had come to them as an orphaned calf, pulled from tornado debris by Gracie's small hands during one of their evening walks. The black and red Brahman bull with the white heart-shaped marking on his forehead had grown into something extraordinary, not just the gentle giant who followed Gracie around like a devoted guardian, but an animal who seemed to understand her medical condition better than most doctors. When Thunder positioned himself between Gracie and danger, when he began that low, rhythmic lowing that meant a seizure was coming, the whole family had learned to pay attention. Nanabelle Mackenzie, 85 years of prairie wisdom wrapped in a flour-dusted apron, shuffled around the kitchen with the determined energy of a woman who'd outlived 2 husbands and raised 3 generations on faith and stubbornness. She'd been the one to insist they keep Thunder when the neighbors whispered about the danger of letting a child play with a bull. "That animal's got the Lord's hand on him," she'd declared, and in a family where Bell's word was gospel, that settled the matter. Ezekiel Morrison, Sarah Bell's younger brother, carried his own shadows from the war overseas and the rodeo circuits that had been his escape afterward. At 38, Zeke moved with the careful precision of a man who'd learned to read animals and danger with equal skill, though the family secrets he carried made him keep his distance, even when his heart pulled him closer to the niece who looked so much like his lost sister. The November wind rattled the windows as Tom watched Thunder lift his massive head toward the house, those intelligent brown eyes seeming to search for something only he could sense. The stack of bills on Tom's kitchen table had grown taller than Gracie's favorite storybooks. each envelope a reminder of how quickly medical emergencies could devour a family's future. $47,000 in outstanding medical debt, with more accumulating every month as Gracie's seizures became more frequent and resistant to standard treatments. The insurance company had started denying claims with increasing creativity, citing experimental treatments and pre-existing conditions with the cold efficiency of corporate bureaucracy. Tom worked 3 jobs now, managing the ranch before dawn, fixing engines at Patterson's garage through the afternoon, and hauling construction materials on weekends. His hands were permanently stained with motor oil and calloused from honest work, but honest work didn't pay specialist fees or cover the medications that kept his daughter stable. The bank had already sent 2 foreclosure notices, each one politely worded but carrying the unmistakable threat that the Mackenzie family's 4-generation legacy could be sold at auction within 30 days. Nana Bell had been hiding her own medical bills in the bottom drawer of her bedroom dresser, thinking Tom had enough burdens without knowing about her heart medication and the doctor's concerned warnings about stress. At 85, she'd survived the Dust Bowl, 2 wars, and more heartbreak than any woman should bear. But watching her great-granddaughter suffer while the family struggled to afford proper care was testing even her legendary faith. Thunder's behavior had been changing over the past month in ways that both amazed and worried the family. The bull's seizure alerts had become so precise that Dr. Sarah Wilson, the local veterinarian, had started documenting his responses for a research paper she hoped might help other families. Thunder could detect Gracie's seizures 15 minutes before any medical equipment registered abnormal brain activity, positioning himself to cushion her falls and staying vigilant throughout each episode with the dedication of a trained medical professional. The insurance company had responded to Dr. Wilson's documentation by threatening to drop the Mackenzie family's coverage entirely, citing the presence of a dangerous animal as an unacceptable liability risk. The irony wasn't lost on Tom that the creature protecting his daughter was being labeled as the source of danger by people who'd never set foot on a working ranch or witnessed Thunder's gentle intelligence firsthand. Other animals on the ranch had begun responding to Thunder's alerts as well, creating an early warning system that extended far beyond the house. The horses would grow restless and pace in their stalls, the cattle would gather at the fence line facing the house, and even the barn cats would seek higher ground, as if some invisible signal had passed through the animal kingdom that humans couldn't perceive. The annual Redemption Valley County Fair had been a family tradition for over a century, where neighbors gathered to celebrate another year survived and to show off their best livestock, preserves, and quilts. This year, Tom had been reluctant to attend, knowing that crowds and overstimulation could trigger Gracie's seizures. But his daughter had pleaded with the earnest determination that reminded him so painfully of Sarah Bell, asking to see her friends and feel normal for just one day. Nana Bell had supported Gracie's request with the wisdom that came from raising children during harder times. "Child needs normal, not cotton wool," she'd declared, settling the matter with the authority that still governed family decisions. "Thunder'll watch over her, and we'll be right there besides. Can't keep her locked away from living just because living's got risks." The decision to bring Thunder to the fair had sparked controversy throughout the community. The fair board had initially refused permission for a bull to attend, citing safety concerns and insurance liability. But Judge Martha Whitfield, a family friend who'd known the Mackenzies since Tom was Gracie's age, had intervened with the legal authority that came from 40 years on the bench and the respect that came from fair judgment. Dr. Harrison Blackwood had volunteered to provide medical support at the fair, a gesture that seemed generous until Tom remembered the doctor's strange insistence that Thunder posed an unacceptable risk to children. Blackwood had been pushing for months to have the bull removed from the property, citing medical liability and child safety concerns that seemed to go beyond normal professional caution. As the family prepared for the fair that Saturday morning, Thunder had grown increasingly agitated, pacing the fence line and making the low vocalizations that usually preceded Gracie's seizures. But Gracie seemed fine, excited about the day ahead and chattering about the friends she'd see and the animals she'd pet at the petting zoo. Tom loaded Thunder into the specially modified livestock trailer, watching in the rearview mirror as his daughter pressed her small hand against the bull's massive nose through the slats. The sight should have brought him comfort, but something in Thunder's behavior suggested that this day would test their family in ways none of them were prepared to handle. The Redemption Valley County Fair sprawled across Miller's Field like a carnival from a simpler time, with red and white striped tents fluttering in the November breeze and the sweet smell of kettle corn mixing with the earthy scent of livestock. 200 families had gathered for what had become the community's most cherished tradition, where children ran between booths with sticky fingers and wide smiles, while their parents caught up on a year's worth of gossip and genuine concern for their neighbors. Gracie practically bounced in her seat as Tom parked the truck near the livestock area, her excitement infectious, despite the knot of worry that had been growing in his stomach since they'd left the ranch. Thunder had been restless throughout the entire drive, making soft vocalizations that Tom had never heard before, not quite distress calls, but not the contented sounds of a calm animal either. The bull's massive head kept turning toward Gracie in the cab, his intelligent brown eyes holding an intensity that made Tom's combat-trained instincts prickle with unease. Dr. Harrison Blackwood was already set up at the medical tent when they arrived, his silver hair perfectly groomed and his crisp white coat standing out among the denim and flannel of the farming community. At 62, Blackwood carried himself with the authority of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, though his medical background was actually veterinary rather than human medicine, a detail few people in Redemption Valley knew or questioned. His transition to treating people had been gradual and largely unnoticed, helped by the rural community's desperate need for any medical professional willing to serve their isolated area. The sight of Thunder being unloaded from the trailer brought an immediate crowd of curious onlookers, some admiring the bull's impressive size and gentle demeanor, others expressing concern about having such a large animal around children. Blackwood's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face paled and his hands trembled slightly as he watched Thunder step down the ramp with the careful precision of an animal aware of his own power and the fragility of those around him. "This is highly irregular," Blackwood approached Tom with the clipped tone of professional disapproval. "Large livestock animals have no business in a public gathering like this. The liability issues alone should be enough to reconsider this decision." His voice carried an edge that went beyond normal medical caution, touching on something deeper and more personal that Tom couldn't quite identify. Judge Martha Whitfield materialized beside them with the timing that came from 40 years of mediating community disputes. At 78, she moved with the determined energy of a woman who'd learned that justice often required personal intervention rather than courtroom formality. "Dr. Blackwood, I believe we've already settled this matter. The Mackenzie family has proper insurance and documentation, and Thunder has never shown aggressive behavior toward humans. This is a farming community, Doctor. We don't fear our livestock here." The tension between Blackwood and the judge was palpable, representing a larger conflict between outside authority and local wisdom that had been simmering in rural communities across America. Blackwood's medical credentials commanded respect, but Judge Whitfield's deep roots and fair judgment had earned something more valuable: trust that had been built over decades of putting community welfare above personal interests. Thunder's behavior throughout the morning remained unusually vigilant, staying closer to Gracie than normal and showing signs of the alerting behavior that preceded her seizures. But Gracie seemed perfectly fine, delighting in the attention from other children who were fascinated by her gentle giant companion. She led Thunder through the fairgrounds with the confidence of a child who'd never known her best friend to be anything but protective and kind. The crisis began so subtly that most observers missed the warning signs entirely. Thunder's low vocalizations became more frequent and urgent, his massive body positioning itself between Gracie and the growing crowd with increasing determination. The bull's head lowered in the specific stance that Tom had learned to recognize as an immediate alert, but Gracie was laughing and playing with no visible signs of distress. "Doctor." Blackwood was watching Thunder's behavior with an intensity that seemed to go beyond professional interest, his hands clenched at his sides and sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool November air. When Thunder began the rhythmic pawing that always preceded Gracie's most severe seizures, Blackwood stepped forward with an authority that brooked no argument. "Everyone needs to step back," Blackwood commanded, his voice carrying across the fairgrounds with surprising volume. "That animal is showing aggressive behavior patterns. We need to separate the child from the bull immediately for her own safety." His assessment contradicted everything Tom knew about Thunder's behavior, but the doctor's medical authority gave weight to his words among the concerned parents gathering around them. The seizure struck Gracie without any warning her family could detect, though Thunder had been alerting for nearly 20 minutes. Her small body went rigid in the classic pattern they'd witnessed dozens of times before, but this episode was different, longer, more severe, and occurring in front of hundreds of witnesses who'd never seen anything like it. Parents pulled their children away in horror, while others rushed forward to help, creating exactly the kind of chaotic environment that could worsen Gracie's condition. Thunder immediately positioned himself as he'd been trained by instinct and experience, his massive body providing a cushion between Gracie and the hard ground, while his calm presence helped minimize the crowd's panic. But Dr. Blackwood's reaction was swift and decisive, pushing past Tom and Annabelle to take control of the medical emergency with an authority that seemed to override the family's own understanding of their daughter's condition. The ambulance ride to Mercy General Hospital became a nightmare of medical decisions that seemed to contradict everything Tom knew about his daughter's condition. Dr. Blackwood had insisted on accompanying them, taking charge of Gracie's care with an authority that the paramedics didn't question, but that made Tom's instincts scream warnings he couldn't articulate. Thunder had been left behind at the fairgrounds, bellowing with a sound that carried across 3 counties, a desperate, haunting cry that echoed in Tom's ears, even as the ambulance sirens drowned out most other sounds. Gracie's seizure had lasted 8 minutes, longer than any previous episode, and her recovery was slower than normal. Dr. Blackwood administered medications that Tom had never seen before, explaining them in rapid medical terminology that sounded authoritative but felt wrong in ways Tom couldn't explain. When Tom asked about Thunder being present during Gracie's recovery, something that had always helped her regain consciousness more quickly, Blackwood dismissed the suggestion with cold professionalism. "Mr. Mackenzie, your daughter needs proper medical care, not folk remedies involving livestock," Blackwood stated as he adjusted the IV drip to a rate that seemed higher than necessary. "Large animals have no place in a sterile medical environment. We'll be following established protocols, not accommodating superstitious attachments to farm animals." His tone carried a finality that discouraged further questions, but Tom noticed how the doctor's hands shook slightly when administering the medications. At Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Blackwood's influence became even more pronounced as he took charge of Gracie's treatment with an expertise that impressed the nursing staff but continued to trouble Tom's growing unease. The hospital's policy regarding animals was strictly enforced. No exceptions, no special circumstances, no consideration for Thunder's documented ability to help with Gracie's seizures. The separation felt cruel and counterproductive, especially as Gracie's condition failed to improve at the expected rate. The medical tests that followed seemed unusually extensive and strangely delayed. Blood work that should have taken hours was pushed to the next day due to laboratory backlogs. Brain scans were rescheduled twice because of equipment malfunctions that other patients didn't seem to experience. Insurance pre-authorizations that normally processed within hours were held up for additional review, creating delays that added both time and expense to Gracie's treatment. Tom's attempts to get second opinions were met with bureaucratic roadblocks that seemed to multiply with each request. Dr. Blackwood explained that transferring Gracie to a specialized children's hospital would be medically inadvisable, given her current condition, though he couldn't clearly articulate why her condition required her to remain at a rural hospital with limited pediatric neurology resources. When Tom mentioned Thunder's alerting abilities, Blackwood's response was swift and sharp. "Mr. Mackenzie, I understand that desperate situations make people grasp for any source of hope, but we cannot base medical decisions on the behavior of farm animals," Blackwood said, his voice carrying an edge that went beyond professional disagreement. "Your daughter needs evidence-based medicine, not the kind of primitive thinking that gets children hurt or killed." The intensity of his reaction seemed disproportionate to Tom's suggestion, hinting at personal motivations that went beyond standard medical practice. Meanwhile, 3 miles away at the fairgrounds, Thunder's behavior was becoming a community concern. The bull had broken through 2 temporary enclosures and was pacing the perimeter fence with an agitation that other livestock owners had never witnessed. Local veterinarian Dr. Sarah Wilson documented Thunder's distress, noting vocalizations and movement patterns that suggested the animal was responding to something beyond normal separation anxiety. Nana Bell had remained at the hospital, her faith shaken but her determination unbroken as she watched her great-granddaughter's condition deteriorate in ways that defied her decades of experience with Gracie's seizures. The medications Dr. Blackwood was administering seemed to keep Gracie in a deeper state of unconsciousness than normal, and her responses to stimuli were weaker than they'd ever been following previous episodes. "Something ain't right about this," Nana Bell whispered to Tom during one of the rare moments when Dr. Blackwood was out of the room. "That child's never stayed under this long, and she's never looked so gray. And that doctor, he gets nervous every time we mention Thunder. What kind of medical man gets nervous about an animal that's been helping a child?" Her voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd learned to trust her instincts over authority figures who claimed to know better. The hospital's billing department began presenting Tom with cost estimates that seemed to escalate with each passing hour. Procedures that weren't clearly explained were being added to Gracie's treatment plan, and the insurance company was finding new reasons to delay or deny coverage. The financial pressure was clearly designed to force quick decisions about Gracie's care, though the medical reasoning behind the urgency remained unclear. Dr. Blackwood's behavior toward Tom and Nana Bell grew increasingly dismissive as they asked more questions about Gracie's treatment protocol. His explanations became more technical and less patient, using medical terminology as a barrier rather than a tool for communication. When Zeke Morrison arrived at the hospital with updates about Thunder's distress, Blackwood's reaction was immediate and hostile. "I don't want to hear about that animal," Blackwood snapped, his professional composure cracking for the first time. "That bull is exactly the kind of dangerous influence that leads to situations like this. Large livestock animals should not be around children, period. The sooner that family accepts this reality, the better off everyone will be." His vehemence suggested personal experience rather than professional judgment. The insurance complications were becoming more bizarre with each passing hour. Claims that should have been routine were being flagged for additional investigation. The hospital's financial counselor presented Tom with papers suggesting immediate payment for services already rendered, despite the family's insurance coverage being current and valid. The pressure to make financial decisions was clearly designed to distract from medical questions that were becoming more difficult to answer. Thunder's escape from the fairgrounds that evening became local legend within hours. The massive bull had somehow broken through a reinforced steel gate and was making his way toward town with the determination of an animal following an invisible trail. Law enforcement was called to manage the dangerous animal situation, but Thunder showed no aggression toward humans, only single-minded purpose in reaching his destination. Back at the hospital, Gracie's condition continued to deteriorate in ways that contradicted Dr. Blackwood's optimistic predictions. Her brain activity was lower than it had ever been following previous seizures, and her physical responses were so minimal that Tom began to fear the worst. When he demanded to speak with other doctors for comparison opinions, Blackwood's response was swift and authoritative. "Mr. Mackenzie, I understand that fear makes people want multiple opinions, but constantly questioning medical decisions can actually harm your daughter's care," Blackwood stated with the kind of professional authority that was difficult to challenge. Second-guessing established protocols based on emotional attachments to animals is exactly the kind of thinking that leads to medical negligence lawsuits. Trust the science, not superstition. The community response to Thunder's escape was divided between those who saw it as evidence of the deep bond between the bull and Gracie, and those who viewed it as confirmation that large animals were unpredictable and dangerous. The debate raged through social media and coffee shop conversations, with Dr. Blackwood's supporters pointing to his medical credentials, while Thunder's defenders cited years of gentle behavior and life-saving seizure alerts. As the second day of Gracie's hospitalization dawned with no improvement in her condition, Tom's desperation began to override his deference to medical authority. The combination of escalating bills, insurance delays, and his daughter's unexplained deterioration created a perfect storm of anxiety that was exactly what Dr. Blackwood seemed to be orchestrating. The trap was closing around the Mackenzie family with the precision of a carefully planned campaign. The third day at Mercy General Hospital brought a medical emergency that would haunt Tom Mackenzie for the rest of his life. Gracie's vital signs had been declining steadily despite Dr. Blackwood's reassurances that her condition was stabilizing within expected parameters. The monitors showed heart rates that were dropping to dangerous levels, oxygen saturation that required increasing support, and brain activity that registered barely above the threshold for consciousness. Dr. Blackwood's demeanor had shifted from confident authority to barely controlled tension as he moved between Gracie's room and hushed conversations with hospital administrators in the hallway. His explanations for her deteriorating condition became increasingly vague, filled with medical terminology that sounded impressive, but provided no real information about why a child who had recovered from dozens of previous seizures was now fighting for her life. "We're seeing complications that are unusual for her typical seizure pattern," Blackwood explained to Tom and Nana Bell, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that concealed their trembling. "Sometimes neurological events can cascade in ways that previous episodes don't predict. We're doing everything medically appropriate, but you need to prepare yourselves for the possibility that this event may have caused more significant damage than we initially assessed." The insurance company had denied coverage for transfer to Children's Hospital in Oklahoma City, citing the rural hospital's capability to handle pediatric neurological cases despite the obvious limitations of their resources. Dr. Blackwood supported this decision with medical language that emphasized the risks of transport over the potential benefits of specialized care, creating a catch-22 that kept Gracie isolated from the expertise that might actually help her. Tom's requests to have Thunder brought to the hospital were met with increasing hostility from both medical staff and hospital administration. The policy against large animals was presented as immutable law rather than administrative preference, with liability concerns and infection control protocols cited as absolute barriers to any accommodation. The fact that Thunder had never shown aggression and had documented medical alert capabilities was dismissed as irrelevant to hospital safety standards. Meanwhile, Thunder's behavior 3 miles away had escalated beyond anything Dr. Sarah Wilson had ever documented in her veterinary career. The bull had broken through increasingly stronger containment measures, showing a determination that bordered on supernatural as he repeatedly attempted to reach the hospital. Local law enforcement was treating the situation as a public safety emergency, with animal control officers armed with tranquilizer equipment standing ready to subdue what they characterized as a dangerous and unpredictable animal. The community response was fracturing along lines that reflected deeper divisions about traditional wisdom versus modern authority. Older residents who remembered when animals were partners rather than possessions supported the Mackenzie family's belief in Thunder's special connection to Gracie. Younger families, influenced by urban safety standards and liability concerns, sided with Dr. Blackwood's professional assessment that large animals posed unacceptable risks to children. Judge Martha Whitfield had begun making unofficial inquiries about the hospital's treatment protocols, her legal instincts aroused by the unusual insurance delays and the systematic barriers to second opinions. Her 40 years on the bench had taught her to recognize patterns of behavior that served interests other than justice, and the Mackenzie case was showing too many red flags to ignore. "Something doesn't smell right about this whole situation," Judge Whitfield confided to her longtime friend and retired nurse, Margaret Odell, over coffee at the Main Street diner. "That child's been managing her condition for 3 years with that bull's help, and now suddenly the animal's dangerous and the child's dying. I've seen enough corruption in my time to know when somebody's got their thumb on the scales." Dr. Blackwood's medical decisions became increasingly aggressive as Gracie's condition worsened, with treatments that seemed designed to suppress her body's natural recovery processes rather than support them. When Tom questioned the necessity of keeping Gracie so heavily sedated, Blackwood's response was swift and authoritative, using medical terminology that discouraged further questions while providing no real explanations. "Mr. Mackenzie, your daughter's brain is in a very delicate state right now," Blackwood explained with the patience of someone addressing a child. "The medications we're using are precisely calibrated to prevent further seizure activity that could cause permanent damage. Reducing sedation prematurely could trigger catastrophic neurological events that would leave her in a vegetative state permanently. Trust the science, not your emotions." The financial pressure on the Mackenzie family reached crisis levels as hospital bills mounted and insurance claims remained in bureaucratic limbo. The ranch's foreclosure deadline was approaching rapidly, and Tom found himself facing the impossible choice between his daughter's medical care and his family's generational legacy. The timing seemed too coincidental to be accidental, as if multiple systems were coordinating to destroy the family's stability simultaneously. Nannabelle's health began declining under the stress of watching her great-granddaughter deteriorate while being powerless to help. Her faith, which had sustained her through 8 decades of hardship, was being tested by the apparent cruelty of losing Gracie just as they'd lost Sarah Bell. Her whispered prayers in the hospital chapel carried a desperation that worried Tom almost as much as Gracie's condition. "Lord, I've never asked for much," Nannabelle prayed with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I've buried my share and carried my load without complaint. But this little angel don't deserve what's happening to her. If you need to take somebody, take me instead." She's got so much life left to live, and I'm just an old woman who's seen enough sorrow for 10 lifetimes. The moment that would change everything came at 11:47 p.m. on November 15th, when Dr. Blackwood emerged from Gracie's room with the expression that every family member learns to dread. His face carried the practiced solemnity of someone who had delivered bad news before, though something in his eyes suggested relief rather than genuine grief. Tom knew what was coming before the doctor spoke, but nothing could have prepared him for the finality of the words. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Mackenzie," Dr. Blackwood said, his voice carrying professional sympathy that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. "Despite our best efforts, Grace Elizabeth Mackenzie passed away at 11:47 p.m. Her brain activity ceased, and we were unable to restart her heart after it stopped." The damage from the prolonged seizure episode was simply too extensive for her young body to overcome. The death certificate was signed with unusual speed, and the procedures for releasing Gracie's body were expedited in ways that seemed designed to prevent second opinions or additional testing. Dr. Blackwood's efficiency in handling the paperwork suggested experience with similar situations, though his behavior remained strangely nervous for someone performing routine medical procedures. Tom's world collapsed in ways that made Sarah Bell's death seem like a mere rehearsal for this ultimate devastation. The sound that escaped his throat was barely human, a keening wail that brought nurses running and left Nana Bell clutching her chest as if her own heart was breaking. 3 miles away, thunder's bellowing shook windows throughout Redemption Valley, a sound so mournful that even his critics felt their hearts clench with unexpected sympathy. The funeral preparations began immediately, with the efficiency that felt almost indecent in its haste. Dr. Blackwood had signed the death certificate within an hour of Gracie's passing, citing complications from status epilepticus with resulting cardiopulmonary failure, in medical language that sounded authoritative but felt hollow to anyone who had known the vibrant child. The funeral home director, a nervous man named Peterson, who had been handling Redemption Valley's final farewells for 20 years, seemed unusually eager to expedite the process. "Given the circumstances and the family's financial situation, I think we should move forward quickly," Peterson explained to Tom, with the kind of gentle pressure that funeral directors had perfected over decades of dealing with grieving families. The longer these things drag out, the more difficult they become for everyone involved. "We can have everything arranged for Saturday morning. That's only 3 days, which gives folks time to make arrangements without drawing things out unnecessarily." Tom moved through the arrangements like a man walking underwater, making decisions about coffins and flowers and burial plots while his mind refused to accept that his daughter was truly gone. The small white coffin seemed impossibly tiny for all the love and hope it would carry into the ground beside Sarah Bell's grave at Hillside Cemetery. The sight of it broke something fundamental inside him, leaving him hollow and brittle as autumn leaves. Nana Bell had aged a decade in the 3 days since Gracie's death, her legendary strength finally cracking under the weight of losing the child who had been her reason for continuing. She sat in her rocking chair for hours, staring out the window toward the pasture where Thunder paced endlessly along the fence line, both of them mourning in their own way for the little girl who had connected their worlds. The community response was overwhelming in its generosity and heartbreaking in its helplessness. Neighbors brought casseroles and condolences, offering practical help with funeral expenses and ranch work while struggling to find words that could address such a profound loss. The tragedy had united the town in grief, temporarily setting aside the divisions about Thunder's place in Gracie's life as everyone focused on supporting the Mackenzie family through their darkest hour. Thunder's behavior during those 3 days became legendary among the ranchers and farmers who understood animal grief in ways that city folks never could. The massive bull had worn a path along the fence line closest to the hospital, pacing with a determination that suggested he was trying to break through barriers he couldn't understand. When Tom finally brought Gracie's body home for the wake, Thunder's bellowing could be heard for miles, a sound so mournful that even the hardest men in the county felt tears in their eyes. Dr. Blackwood had volunteered to attend the funeral, presenting his presence as a final gesture of medical support for the family while privately ensuring that no uncomfortable questions arose about Gracie's sudden deterioration and death. His behavior in the days following her passing had been professionally appropriate but personally distant, as if he was already moving on to other patients and other concerns, rather than grieving the loss of a child he had supposedly fought to save. The financial pressure on the Mackenzie family intensified, even as the community rallied to help with funeral expenses. The hospital's billing department had been unusually aggressive in demanding immediate payment for Gracie's final treatment, threatening collection actions that seemed cruel even by corporate healthcare standards. The ranch foreclosure proceedings had been mysteriously accelerated, with bank representatives citing changed circumstances that required immediate resolution. Judge Martha Whitfield had been making discreet inquiries about the hospital's treatment of the Mackenzie case, her legal instincts aroused by the unusual speed of both Gracie's decline and the subsequent administrative processes. Her conversations with retired medical professionals in the community had raised questions about Dr. Blackwood's treatment protocols, though proving medical malpractice in a rural setting where everyone knew everyone else was a delicate matter that required careful handling. The night before the funeral, Thunder had broken through every barrier the family and neighbors could construct, disappearing from the ranch with a determination that left even experienced cattlemen baffled. Search parties had been organized to find the bull, with concerns ranging from his safety to the potential liability if he wandered onto roads or into populated areas where his grief-driven behavior might be misunderstood as aggression. Tom spent that final night in Gracie's room, surrounded by her stuffed animals and drawings and the thousand small reminders of a life cut short just as it was beginning to bloom. The silence felt oppressive after years of Thunder's protective presence and Gracie's cheerful chatter filling the house with life and hope. Tomorrow he would bury his daughter beside her mother, and the future stretched ahead like an empty road leading nowhere he wanted to go. The morning of November 18th dawned gray and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that seemed to reflect the community's collective grief as they prepared to say goodbye to Grace Elizabeth Mackenzie, the little girl whose courage and kindness had touched every life in Redemption Valley. The moment Zeke Morrison saw Thunder standing atop Gracie's coffin, every instinct honed by years of reading animal behavior in rodeo arenas and military combat zones screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with everything they'd been told. The massive bull wasn't grieving. He was alerting, using the same precise positioning and vocalizations that had preceded every one of Gracie's seizures for the past year. Zeke's weathered hands shook as he pushed through the horrified crowd, his voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of a man who had learned to trust animal intelligence over human assumptions. "That bull ain't mourning," Zeke announced, his voice carrying across the cemetery with the clarity of someone accustomed to being heard over wind and machinery. "I've worked with animals my whole life, and that's alerting behavior. Thunder's trying to tell us something, and we better damn well listen before we make a mistake we can't undo." His words sent a ripple of shock through the assembled mourners, many of whom had never questioned Dr. Blackwood's pronouncement of death. Dr. Blackwood's reaction was immediate and visceral, his face draining of color as he stepped forward with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Mr. Morrison, I understand that grief can make people see things that aren't there, but that animal is simply responding to stress and unfamiliar surroundings. Grace Mackenzie is deceased, confirmed by multiple medical assessments and documented with proper certification. This disruption is causing unnecessary trauma to an already grieving family." But Judge Martha Whitfield had spent 40 years learning to recognize truth from deception, and something in Dr. Blackwood's vehement response triggered every judicial instinct she'd developed over decades of separating fact from fiction. Doctor, in my experience, when someone protests too much about a simple request for verification, it usually means there's something worth verifying, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect in courtrooms across 3 counties. The crowd had divided into factions as the drama unfolded, with traditional farming families who understood animal behavior supporting Zeke's interpretation, while others sided with Dr. Blackwood's medical authority. The tension was palpable as 300 people found themselves witnesses to a debate that challenged fundamental assumptions about life, death, and the reliability of both modern medicine and ancient wisdom. Thunder remained positioned atop the coffin with unwavering determination, his massive body serving as both protection and protest against the proceedings that everyone had assumed were inevitable. His low, rhythmic vocalizations continued in the pattern that Tom had learned to recognize as an urgent medical alert. But the sound was different somehow, deeper, more desperate, as if the bull was using every ounce of his strength to communicate something beyond normal animal expression. Tom Mackenzie stood frozen between opposing truths, his grief-shattered mind struggling to process the possibility that his daughter might still be alive while fearing the cruelty of false hope. "My baby's been gone for 3 days," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crowd's murmurs. The doctor checked everything. The machine showed no heartbeat, no brain activity. How could... His voice broke as the terrible possibility began to take shape in his mind. Nanabelle's voice cut through the uncertainty with the clarity of faith tested but unbroken. "Thomas William Mackenzie, that bull saved your daughter's life more times than we can count, and he's never been wrong about her condition. If Thunder says she's alive, then by God's grace, she's alive, and we're about to commit a sin that'll haunt us for the rest of our days." Her words carried the weight of 8 decades of wisdom and the absolute conviction of someone who had learned to trust divine intervention over human fallibility. Dr. Blackwood's professional composure was cracking under the pressure of questions he hadn't anticipated answering. "This is highly irregular and potentially traumatic for everyone involved," he insisted, his voice rising with each word. "Opening sealed caskets based on animal behavior sets a dangerous precedent that could undermine public confidence in medical certification processes. We have procedures and protocols for a reason, and those procedures were followed meticulously in this case." Judge Whitfield stepped forward with the authority that came from representing justice rather than special interests. "Doctor, I'm ordering a medical examination of the deceased before burial proceeds. This is well within my legal authority, and given the unusual circumstances and the documented history of this animal's medical alerting capabilities, I believe it constitutes due diligence rather than disruption." Her words carried the force of law, but more importantly, they carried the moral weight of ensuring that no mistake would be made that couldn't be undone. The examination that followed was conducted by Dr. Sarah Wilson, the veterinarian whose documentation of Thunder's alerting behavior had made her the closest thing to an expert on the unusual relationship between the bull and Gracie. Working quickly but thoroughly, she checked for signs of life that standard hospital equipment might have missed, using techniques that had been developed for animals but applied to humans in unusual circumstances. "I'm detecting a faint but measurable pulse," Dr. Wilson announced after several tense minutes of examination, her voice steady despite the extraordinary implications of her findings. "Heart rate approximately 8 beats per minute, which is consistent with deep cataleptic states that can mimic death in rare neurological cases. Body temperature is lower than normal, but not consistent with post-mortem cooling. This child appears to be in a profound state of suspended animation rather than actual death." The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd as people struggled to process the implications of what they were witnessing. "Doctor." Blackwood's protests became increasingly desperate as the evidence mounted against his medical pronouncement, his authority crumbling under the weight of proof that contradicted his certification of death. "This is impossible," Blackwood insisted, his voice carrying a note of panic that hadn't been present in his earlier professional demeanor. The monitoring equipment showed no cardiac or respiratory activity. Brain scans indicated no neurological function. Multiple medical professionals confirmed the diagnosis. You cannot overturn established medical findings based on wishful thinking and animal behavior. But Thunder's alerting had intensified as Dr. Wilson worked, his behavior becoming more specific and focused, as if he was directing attention to particular aspects of Gracie's condition. The bull's intelligence seemed to extend beyond simple seizure detection, suggesting an understanding of medical situations that went far beyond anything documented in veterinary literature. Zeke Morrison had moved closer to assist Dr. Wilson, his military medical training allowing him to recognize signs that others might miss. "Doc, look at her fingernails," he said quietly, pointing to subtle color changes that indicated circulation rather than post-mortem changes. "And watch her chest. There's movement there, real shallow but steady. This child's alive, just barely, but she's fighting to come back." The emergency medical response that followed was swift and professional, with paramedics arriving to transport Gracie to specialized facilities equipped to handle unusual neurological conditions. Dr. Blackwood's attempts to maintain control of the situation were overruled by Judge Whitfield's legal authority and the family's demands for transfer to Children's Hospital in Oklahoma City, where pediatric specialists could provide care that rural facilities couldn't match. As Gracie was carefully transferred to emergency transport, Thunder's behavior shifted from alerting to protective, positioning himself to maintain visual contact with the child while allowing medical personnel to do their work. The bull's intelligence and emotional sophistication were on full display as he seemed to understand that his job was to guide rather than interfere with the humans working to save his young companion. Dr. Blackwood's final attempts to control the narrative crumbled as evidence mounted of unusual decisions and questionable protocols that had characterized Gracie's treatment. His insistence that the child was deceased, despite mounting evidence to the contrary, raised questions about his motivations and competence that would require investigation by medical licensing boards and law enforcement agencies. The conspiracy that emerged from subsequent investigations revealed a systematic effort to remove Thunder from Gracie's life by any means necessary, including medical sabotage that had nearly resulted in her actual death. Dr. Blackwood's personal trauma from his son's death in a bull-related accident 10 years earlier had evolved into an obsession with preventing similar tragedies, leading him to view Thunder as a threat that needed elimination regardless of the consequences to the Mackenzie family. The land development scheme that had been operating behind the scenes involved hospital administrators and banking officials who saw opportunity in the Mackenzie family's financial distress. By ensuring that Gracie's medical bills remained unpayable and her condition untreatable, they could force foreclosure on prime ranch property that was worth millions for development purposes. Thunder's extraordinary intervention had not only saved Gracie's life but exposed a network of corruption that had been operating in Redemption Valley for years, targeting vulnerable families with a combination of medical malpractice and financial manipulation that destroyed lives while enriching conspirators who had sworn oaths to help rather than harm their community members. 2 years later, on a warm September afternoon that painted the Oklahoma hills in shades of gold and amber, Grace Elizabeth Mackenzie sat on Thunder's broad back as he grazed peacefully in the front pasture of what had become known throughout the state as Thunder's Haven Therapy Ranch. At 8 years old now, Gracie had grown into a confident, compassionate child whose seizures were managed through a combination of proper medication, Thunder's early warning system, and the kind of comprehensive medical care that had been denied to her during those dark days at Mercy General Hospital. The legal settlement from the medical malpractice lawsuit had not only saved the Mackenzie Ranch, but transformed it into something far more valuable than anyone could have imagined. Thunder's Haven had become a pioneering facility where children with neurological conditions could work with specially trained therapy animals, creating bonds that provided both medical benefits and emotional healing that traditional medicine struggled to achieve alone. Dr. Harrison Blackwood had lost his medical license after investigations revealed the extent of his deception and the personal motivations that had driven him to endanger Gracie's life. The conspiracy that emerged during the trial had shocked even veteran law enforcement officers, revealing a network of corruption that extended from hospital administration to banking and land development interests that had targeted vulnerable families throughout rural Oklahoma for systematic exploitation. The scariest part wasn't the medical malpractice, Tom often told visitors to the ranch, his arm resting on Thunder's massive neck as the bulls stood patiently beside them. It was realizing how many people were willing to let a child die to cover up their mistakes and protect their profits. If Thunder hadn't refused to accept what everyone else was willing to believe, we would have buried our daughter alive and never known the truth. Judge Martha Whitfield had become a champion for rural healthcare reform and animal-assisted therapy programs, using Gracie's case as a catalyst for legislation that required second opinions in cases involving children with complex medical conditions. Her tireless advocacy had led to the Gracie's Law legislation that provided legal protections for families seeking alternative medical opinions and established protocols for incorporating documented therapy animals into hospital treatment plans. Nana Bell, now 87 but reinvigorated by her great-granddaughter's miraculous recovery, had become the ranch's unofficial historian and wisdom keeper, sharing stories with visiting families about the power of faith, persistence, and trusting instincts over authority when something fundamental didn't feel right. Her rocking chair on the front porch had become a destination for parents struggling with their own medical challenges, seeking guidance from someone who had faced the worst and emerged stronger. Some folks think miracles stopped happening when the good book was finished, Nana Bell would tell visitors, her eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed the impossible firsthand. They just ain't been paying attention. Miracles happen every day around here. They just usually weigh 1,000 pounds, eat grass, and have better sense than most doctors with fancy degrees. Zeke Morrison had found his calling as the ranch's head trainer, combining his military medical background with his intuitive understanding of animal behavior to develop protocols that other therapy facilities were now adopting across the country. His relationship with Tom had evolved from uncomfortable family obligation to genuine partnership, bound together by their shared commitment to Gracie's welfare and their respect for Thunder's extraordinary capabilities. The therapy program at Thunder's Haven had attracted attention from medical researchers, veterinary colleges, and families from across the nation seeking alternatives to traditional neurological treatment approaches. Thunder himself had become something of a celebrity, featured in medical journals and documentary films that explored the mysterious connections between human health and animal intelligence. Dr. Sarah Wilson had been appointed as the ranch's chief veterinary consultant, her documentation of Thunder's alerting behavior having evolved into groundbreaking research on animal-assisted medical detection. Her work was helping to establish scientific frameworks for understanding and utilizing the remarkable sensory capabilities that animals like Thunder possessed, bridging the gap between folk wisdom and evidence-based medicine. The children who came to Thunder's Haven were paired with therapy animals based on careful assessment of their medical needs, personality traits, and the specific capabilities of individual animals. Thunder worked primarily with seizure disorders, but the ranch now housed horses trained for mobility assistance, goats specialized in anxiety reduction, and even a few cattle dogs who had shown remarkable abilities in detecting blood sugar fluctuations in diabetic children. Gracie's own recovery had exceeded every medical prediction, though she still required careful monitoring and medication management. Thunder's alerting system had become so sophisticated that he could detect seizure precursors up to 30 minutes before onset, giving Gracie and her family unprecedented control over her condition. The partnership between girl and bull had evolved into something that transcended typical human-animal relationships, creating a bond that seemed to operate on levels that science was only beginning to understand. The financial transformation of the Mackenzie family's circumstances had been dramatic but carefully managed, with settlement funds invested in the therapy ranch infrastructure rather than personal luxuries. Tom had hired additional staff and expanded the facilities to accommodate more families, but the ranch maintained its authentic working farm atmosphere rather than becoming a commercialized treatment center. Corporate accountability had become a major focus of the legal reforms that emerged from Gracie's case, with new oversight requirements for rural hospitals and stronger protections against the kind of financial manipulation that had nearly destroyed the Mackenzie family. The bank officials and hospital administrators who had participated in the land grab scheme faced criminal charges and civil liability that sent clear messages about the consequences of exploiting vulnerable families. The community of Redemption Valley had been forever changed by the events surrounding Gracie's near-death experience, with increased awareness of both the potential for institutional corruption and the importance of trusting community wisdom over outside authority when fundamental questions about right and wrong were at stake. The town had rallied around the Mackenzie family in ways that strengthened social bonds and created lasting support networks. Thunder's offspring were now being trained at facilities across the country, with his bloodline showing remarkable aptitude for medical detection work that seemed to be partially hereditary. The bulls and cows descended from Thunder were demonstrating abilities that suggested genetic components to their extraordinary sensory capabilities, opening new avenues for research and therapeutic applications. On this particular September afternoon, as Gracie guided Thunder through the pasture where other children worked with their own therapy animals, the scene represented something far more valuable than medical treatment or therapeutic intervention. It embodied the fundamental truth that healing often comes from connections that transcend traditional boundaries, between species, between generations, between scientific knowledge and instinctive wisdom. "People ask me if I'm angry about what happened," Tom said to a visiting journalist, watching Gracie laugh as Thunder carefully navigated around smaller animals in the pasture. "But anger can't undo the past, and it sure can't improve the future. What happened to us was terrible, but it led to something beautiful that's helping other families avoid the same nightmare." Thunder saved more than just Gracie's life. He saved our faith in doing the right thing, even when everyone else says you're wrong. As the sun set over Thunder's Haven Therapy Ranch, painting the sky in colors that matched the hope and healing that had emerged from tragedy, the sound of children's laughter mixed with the gentle lowing of cattle and the nickering of horses, creating a symphony of life that celebrated the triumph of love over greed, truth over deception, and the miraculous bonds that connect all living creatures in ways that defy explanation but demand recognition. Dear friends, if you've walked this earth for 5 decades or more, you understand that life's greatest treasures aren't found in bank accounts or fancy titles. They're discovered in the bonds that sustain us through our darkest hours. Thunder and Gracie's story reminds us that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources, and that love truly knows no boundaries of species, size, or circumstance. In our golden years, we've learned that institutions can fail us, Authority figures can betray our trust, and the very systems meant to protect us can become our greatest threats. But we've also learned that faith, persistence, and the courage to trust our instincts over popular opinion can move mountains, or in this case, save a life that everyone else had given up on. Thunder's unwavering devotion teaches us that loyalty isn't just a word, it's a way of being that transforms tragedy into triumph. As we face our own challenges with aging, healthcare, and uncertain futures, may we remember that miracles don't always come with medical degrees. Sometimes they come with 4 hooves and a heart full of unconditional love. Have you ever experienced a moment when an animal seemed to understand your needs better than humans? What lesson from Thunder's story resonates most with your own life experiences? Please share your thoughts in the comments below.